The Subcommittee on Oceans, Atmosphere, Fisheries, and the Coast Guard will now come to order. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our witnesses. We are here for essentially what is an oversight hearing of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which was enacted by Congress in 1972. And this is an extremely important issue for the country. Certainly for my constituents in Alaska and many other coastal states, and even states with upstream tributaries. And as I mentioned, I know some of you had to travel far and shuffle competing demands to be here, so I want to thank everybody for being here. I also want to welcome my ranking member, Senator Tammy Baldwin. She and I have worked on a number of issues together, and I'm excited that she's here. Senator Peters and I had a good working relationship here when he was the ranking member, and certainly look forward to the same with my colleague from Wisconsin. I want to thank Senator Cantwell for being here as well, and Senator Young, and hopefully we're going to have some more members coming in and out for today's hearing. So, as I mentioned, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is the focus of this hearing, was enacted by Congress in 1972 to protect mammals in the marine environment. It took the form of a moratorium on taking marine mammals, that's the legal term. However, the statute also provided authorization for the take of marine mammals in certain circumstances, as well as for incidental effects of categories of activities, including commercial fishing, military defense training and deployment, marine infrastructure, and exploration. Of particular note for my constituents, Alaska Natives were explicitly recognized by Congress for the cultural, subsistence, ecological significance of marine mammals, including walruses, whales, seals, sea lions, otters, and polar bears for Alaska Natives. It's a long list of animals, and not many other states have that many animals. This exemption is allowed on the basis of sustainable use and to provide not just access to food, but also a cash economy sourced from the sustainable production and sale of significantly altered animal products. Finally, the MMPA regulates the public display, import, and care and captive of marine mammals. As originally intended by Congress, the MMPA was designed to restore depleted populations, regulate negative human-animal interactions, and protect populations from dropping below obtainable, sustainable numbers within their ecosystems. By many estimates, the MMPA has been successful in protecting many species. Certain populations of seals, whales, sea lions, walruses, and sea otters have benefited or significantly expanded to carrying capacity within their ecosystems. Despite these successes, there are many issues that continue to arise as the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service oversee marine mammal populations and their interactions with human activity. One issue I wanted to highlight for today's hearing that I've been particularly concerned about is the trend of states enacting overly broad bans on the sale of ivory that includes walrus ivory. Those bans are actually very well intended. They focus on the African elephant and the bans on the sale of ivory there. But everybody would agree, and the Obama administration agreed with us on this issue previously, that those bans of African elephant ivory should not include a walrus ivory, which is legal for Alaska Natives and other indigenous populations to take. The MMPA explicitly authorizes Alaska Natives to sustainably harvest marine mammals as well as create and sell handicrafts made out of the non-edible portions of these animals. Many reports have shown that the confusion related to these legal takings and the bans on African elephants have significantly impacted Alaskan Natives' ability to access economic opportunity. In response, I recently introduced Bill S. 1965, Senator Murkowski is a co-sponsor, the allowing Alaska Ivory Act to preempt these state bans. Beyond walrus ivory, there are other examples we need to review on how the MPAA is working. These include whether existing permitting requirements and management authorities are flexible enough to provide timely implementation of the MPAA, whether we could implement take permits for various activities to more efficiently permit beneficial activity while still protecting marine mammals, whether we can better manage conflicts between the MMPA and the Endangered Species Act, whether we can address conflicts between marine mammals and commercial fisheries to ensure balanced ecosystems through flexible management, and whether there are other fixes to the existing regulatory regimes for public display organizations that could potentially help those organizations more efficiently achieve their missions and goals. We are here today to look at some of these and other issues. As I mentioned at the outset, the MMPA was passed in 1972, and it was last reauthorized in 1994, and there haven't been any even amendments to the law since 2004. Challenges as well as inefficiencies have arisen as a result of changes and successes in population growth and locations, and the development and construction have shifted to new areas. This committee needs to determine where the Department of Commerce, NOAA, and the Fish and Wildlife Service can deploy or tweak their existing authorities to ensure the MMPA works smarter and better for our wildlife, our communities, our fisheries, our native populations, and our ecosystems. Additionally, after 20 years, we need a rigorous assessment of the MMPA's success. And further, we need to closely examine what creative and flexible solutions Congress, the federal agencies, and the states and local stakeholders can employ to achieve the goals of protecting species and communities in a sustainable balance. So I'd like to now turn it over to Ranking Member Baldwin for her opening statement. Welcome.
Thank you. And if I can first respond to your words of welcome, it is a delight to get to join you as the ranking Democrat on this subcommittee. Just like your subcommittee ranking member prior to me, Senator Peters, we both come from Great Lakes states. And oftentimes people think of the state of Wisconsin as flyover territory. I think of it as a state with three coasts, three freshwater coasts, the east coast of Lake Michigan, the north coast of Lake Superior, and the west coast of the St. Croix River and the mighty Mississippi River. And so I'm very much looking forward to the work we are going to do together on this subcommittee. One other tangential note, you were talking about accomplishments and work we have done together. And earlier this morning, we were reflecting on an effort we joined together on to recognize the helicopter pilots of the Vietnam War last week. That project came to full fruition as it was dedicated at Arlington National Cemetery. And it was great to work with you on that.
Great bipartisan success for our veterans.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to greet our distinguished witnesses today and thank you for coming to testify before our subcommittee. In 1972, in response to growing public concern about the negative impacts of human activities on whales, dolphins, seals, and other marine mammal species, this committee and ultimately the full Congress acted to mitigate and reverse those impacts. At the time, many of the great whales which once populated the oceans had dwindled to the edge of extinction as a result of ship strikes, fishing gear entanglements, and other human interactions. As many as 100,000 to 300,000 dolphins per year were estimated to be killed by the U.S. tuna industry during the catching of tuna. Congress responded to these and other negative impacts on marine mammals with the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, the MMPA. The MMPA established a general moratorium on the taking of marine mammals from the wild, with certain exceptions, a permitting regime to manage human interactions, and a Marine Mammal Commission to advise various federal agencies regarding the impacts of their activities on marine mammal species. By most accounts, the MMPA has worked well in achieving its goal, although there are still species that are struggling. This overall success is evidenced by the fact that the MMPA has only been substantially amended once in 1994, and there have been few calls to amend it in the decades since. As the subcommittee looks at the best ways of enhancing the MMPA, as this hearing is entitled, I believe we must be guided, as previous generations were, by the commitment to protect these important species so that they continue to rebound and thrive in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. And we have a distinguished panel, and I'm going to go through it quickly from our left to right. Mr. Chris Oliver, an Alaskan, we're proud to say, who is the Assistant Administrator for Fisheries at NOAA here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Mike Miller, also an Alaskan, who's the Chairman of the Indigenous Peoples Council for Marine Mammals from Anchorage, Alaska. Thank you, Mike, for being here. Mr. Guy Norman, who's the Chair of Fish and Wildlife Committee, Northwest Power and Conservation Council from Portland, Oregon. Dr. Ray Stone, President and Partner of Dolphin Quest, Middleburg, Virginia. And Ms. Jane Davenport, Senior Attorney, Conservation Law Division, Defenders of Wildlife in Washington, D.C. So again, I would like to welcome everybody. Thank you for traveling, some of you many hundreds, if not thousands of miles for this hearing. And Mr. Oliver, we will begin with you. 5 minutes, please. And if there's additional written testimony, we would be glad to submit it for the record.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Senator, good to see you again, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to talk on the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Under the MMPA, we're responsible for protecting certain marine mammals, namely 246 different stocks of cetaceans and pinnipeds. The MMPA established a national policy to prevent marine mammal species and populations from declining beyond the point where they cease to be significant functioning elements of the ecosystem. We are a global leader in marine mammal conservation and sustainable fisheries, with U.S. fisheries abiding by some of the world's most robust conservation practices, including measures to reduce marine mammal bycatch. We have experienced great success over the past 45 years with our efforts under the Act, resulting in a number of stocks recovering to healthy levels. For example, some populations of whales in our waters, including gray and humpback whales, have recovered to levels that they are no longer listed under the Endangered Species Act. Under the auspices of the MMPA, Alaska Natives have continued to exercise their rights to subsistence hunting of many species of marine mammals. Some of the programs for which we regularly receive requests for incidental take authorization include coastal construction projects, oil and gas exploration, military testing and training, renewable energy siting, and biological research. NIMS implementation of the incidental take provisions has allowed numerous activities critical to the U.S. economy and national security to proceed in compliance with the MMPA, while also ensuring protection of marine mammals and subsistence uses. Between 2009 and 12, we issued 11 different 5-year incidental take regulations to bring the Navy into full MMPA compliance for all of its major training and testing activities across the U.S. EEZ. We have achieved MMPA goals for reducing mortality and serious injury of several stocks to below each stock's potential biological removal level, such as beaked whales in California, harbor porpoises in New England, and insular false killer whales in Hawaii. Turning to specific provisions of the MMPA, I want to talk about Section 120, and that's the NIMS allows NIMS to authorize the intentional lethal take of individual pinnipeds that are having a significant negative impact on the decline or recovery of ESA-listed salmonid stocks, mainly Chinook salmon and steelhead, Columbia River, prime example. Pursuant to that authority, states may request authorization to lethally remove pinnipeds. We strongly share concerns about the impact that these robust populations of pinnipeds are having on these ESA-listed salmon and steelhead stocks, and we support amendments to the MMPA which will improve our ability to address those issues. I want to highlight some of the program-based streamlining efforts we have recently implemented. In 2017, in response to multiple executive orders aimed at reducing regulatory burden, we committed to decreasing processing times for typical incidental take authorization requests. And during the year 2017, we reduced the average processing time from what was 21.5 months in the preceding 5 years down to 14.5 months in 2017. And we're going to continue to collect data to track the impacts of those streamlining efforts. Moving forward, we're working on additional measures and guidance to increase efficiency and reduce the burden on the applicants, including measures recommended by the Marine Mammal Commission in a recent GAO audit. Based on the challenges that NMFS and the public have encountered in implementing or complying with the Act, I would like to summarize a subset of ideas that we're considering that could reduce unnecessary burden and improve implementation while ensuring appropriate protection for marine mammals. I would note that we have been in conversations with our sister agencies and the Department of Interior on many of these suggestions. The first, remove the 5-year limitation on incidental take authorizations. The second is increase the maximum time period for incidental harassment authorizations. Currently, we are limited to 1 year on those. Third, and this is a very important one, is remove the small numbers requirement in the incidental take authorizations. As it stands now, for all but military readiness activities, which are exempt from this requirement, we may authorize the take of only small numbers of marine mammals, and I don't have time to elaborate on that, but that's an important one. The fourth is to remove the specified geographic region requirement. At this time, we may authorize take in a single incidental take authorization only if it's within a specified geographic area. However, there are circumstances where the impacts of an activity on marine mammals are similar across multiple regions. Fifth is to clarify the authority to issue renewals of IHAs. And I want to just close by saying we're committed to work with other agencies, including the Department of Interior, on other proposals for streamlining implementation of the Act. And I would welcome any comments that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver, and we all think you're doing a great job there. I'm glad to have you in that very, very important position for the federal government. Mr. Miller, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Mike Miller. I'm actually from Sitka, is where I live, and I'm here. I sit on the Sitka Tribal Council in Southeast, but I'm here as chairman of Indigenous Peoples Council for Marine Mammals, or IPCOM. IPCOM was formed in 1992. It's made up of 17 Alaska Native organizations that are tribal or tribally authorized specifically to speak on issues related to the harvest and use of marine mammals. While our members are distinct organizations working on issues specific to their respective species or geographic region, IPCOM itself holds an umbrella agreement to interact with agencies on issues of common concerns for all our members. Of course, in Section 101 of the MMPA, there is the exemption that the Senator referenced for Alaska Natives to harvest and use marine mammals, a practice that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, and continues to this day in much the same manner. Section 119 of the MMPA does allow for agreements to be developed between federal agencies and Alaska Native organizations for the co-management of the subsistence harvest of marine mammals. The responsible agency for walrus, polar bears, and sea otters is Fish and Wildlife Service under Department of Interior. Department of Commerce, specifically NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service, has other species of whales, which would be bowhead and beluga, sea lions and seals, including fur seals, harbor seals, and ice seals. Alaska still has many communities today that rely heavily on the harvest of marine mammals for food, economic, and cultural purposes. Increasingly, though, communities from the Arctic through the Bering Sea and the Aleutians to southeast are recognizing the importance of having a stronger role in the management or co-management of the marine mammal species they rely on. Issues related to climate change, shifting marine mammal populations, changing in community demographics, and outside misperceptions of the harvest are all having an impact on how our organizations set priorities and use the available resources. Over the past year, IPCOM has worked to increase its effectiveness for the member organizations. For example, in November of last year, we did a mass board training for all the individual board members of the organization. So there's about 120-some people that came And we did specific training to help people understand their roles as nonprofit organizations, their responsibilities to their communities, but also the roles and responsibilities that are required of board members when they are working with federal funding. Sorry, I'm a little bit out of order here. So we have also recently assisted in restructuring a polar bear co-management entity with support of the 15 polar bear harvesting communities and the regional representative organizations as well. The present funding structure requires National Marine Fisheries species organizations with co-management agreements to compete annually for project funding, which also includes base funding's operations, so it's a year-by-year process. U.S. Fish and Wildlife species organizations are funded through annual or multi-year cooperative agreements. National Marine Fisheries does have a specific line item for Section 119 funding, but Fish and Wildlife does not, and we feel like it would be helpful if they did. Outside of our specific current concerns we have related to funding, our relationship, though, with agencies such as Marine Mammal Commission, National Marine Fisheries, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and a lesser role, BIA, are generally very positive at this point. And I will mention, in the case of Fish and Wildlife Service, this is a marked improvement from 2 years ago. There's been essentially a 180 in the working relationship, which we're hoping that the effort towards stronger relationships and partnerships with the agencies continues. Strong Alaska Native involvement is not only essential to management and the harvest and use of marine mammals, but is essential to the full understanding and general management of the species as well. IPCOM member organizations are uniquely created and positioned to provide key information and direction in proper management by federal agencies. IPCOM had previously proposed MMPA language change about 10 years ago, and it was specific to increasing language in support of harvest management prior to depletion. That's something that we would like to continue to look at. We do feel that the MMPA has wonderful language, and so we look at it very cautiously, but we had proposed and would like to again look at essentially what we called harvest management prior to depletion, which one of the key parts of it was adding enforcement provisions for the plans that are locally created. It could be used to address all kinds of things, including the handicraft issues. Certainly a harvest management plan could lead towards sustainable harvest designation, which could help folks. It could be used to deal with definition of Alaska Native for folks and things like that. So we're hoping to continue to work with the committee on that. That being said, again, we like the language in the Act, but in closing, we certainly would like to work with the subcommittee to see if there's changes that could be made to enhance the Act. Thank you for allowing me to testify today, and hope we can continue to do this work.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Norman, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify today. I represent Washington State on the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. The council is an interstate compact composed of the states of Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. It was authorized by the Northwest Power Act of 1980, giving the region a greater voice in how we plan our energy future in balance with mitigation for fish and wildlife resources in the Columbia Basin. As part of a comprehensive recovery strategy for salmon and steelhead, the region is actively addressing long-term issues associated with dam operations, harvest, habitat, hatcheries, and bird and fish predation with long-term solutions. But predation by sea lions is an immediate and increasing problem that needs an immediate solution. There's widespread concern in the region that increasing sea lion predation is offsetting the billions invested in salmon recovery in the basin. The MMPA has been successful in rebuilding the sea lion populations of the West Coast, and that's a good thing. The California sea lion population has grown to nearly 300,000, and biologists believe they are at or near carrying capacity. The Steller sea lion population has also steadily grown, now numbering near 75,000 individuals. These sea lions have historically foraged in the Pacific Ocean and West Coast estuaries. However, in 2001, dozens of adult male sea lions began traveling over 140 miles up the Columbia River to prey on salmon and steelhead at Bonneville Dam. Those numbers soon increased to hundreds each year, prompting state agencies to apply for removal authority at Bonneville Dam, which they received in 2008. Sea lions traveling that far inland is new behavior. According to marine mammal biologists, that did not occur historically. Spring Chinook salmon consumption by sea lions at Bonneville Dam is on the rise, with 9,500 consumed at the dam in 2016, representing almost 6% of the run. These figures are observed salmon mortality within a quarter mile of the dam and do not include the additional 140 miles of river downstream. NOAA Fisheries has conducted a study since 2010 to get a better idea on the sea lion mortality in the entire lower Columbia River. The research has identified an unexplained mortality of spring Chinook salmon that has ranged as high as 43% of the run in 2014 and 37% in 2015, totaling over 100,000 spring Chinook each of those years. The NOAA researcher has concluded these mortalities are likely attributed to sea lion predation. Sea lions are also showing up in the Willamette River in increasing numbers, feeding on spring Chinook, steelhead, and sturgeon. The predation is pushing a wild winter steelhead population to the brink of extinction. The current removal provisions in the MMPA are very restrictive. It takes considerable resources and time to qualify an animal for removal. Senate Bill 1702 would qualify for removal of those sea lions that move far inland above River Mile 112 in the Columbia River and into the tributaries, where diet studies and observations show they are targeting salmon, steelhead, and sturgeon and causing significant damage to the fish populations. The current Section 120 permit requirements have limited the effectiveness of the program and have not provided managers the opportunity to get ahead of the recruitment of new California sea lions, nor have managers been able to deal with increasing numbers of stellar sea lions moving far inland, eating sturgeon and increasingly salmon and steelhead. State and tribal managers need a more streamlined and effective process. This does not mean removal of thousands of sea lions each year. It means rather a program that addresses a small portion of the adult male sea lion population that moves far upstream in the Columbia River and into the tributaries. This number is in the low hundreds of individual sea lions annually and would equate to a fraction of a percent of the West Coast population. I believe it's reasonable to predict that the numbers of removals necessary over time would likely decrease if the program were more effective in the near term. The Council strongly supports updating the Marine Mammal Protection Act to reflect increasing threats from sea lions to endangered salmon and steelhead populations in the Columbia River. And I thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Norman. Dr. Stone, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Chairman Sullivan, Ranking Member Baldwin, and members of the subcommittee. We're here. My name is Dr. Ray Stone. I'm a marine mammal veterinarian with 35 years of experience. And I am, while I am co-founder of Dolphin Quest, I'm testifying today on behalf of the Alliance of Marine Mammal Parks and Aquariums. Accredited Alliance members advance marine mammal conservation through public display, education, research, and the rescue and rehabilitation of stranded animals. Collectively, the 64 members of the Alliance represent the greatest body of experience and knowledge about marine mammals and the care and husbandry in the world. In July 1993, I actually had the privilege of testifying before this committee on the reauthorization of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Our support for the Act and its conservation goals remains constant and strong. Education is an integral part of our mission. Millions of people who visit our parks every year have an opportunity to connect with animals in meaningful and memorable ways. Guests tell us these connections create a powerful appreciation for the natural environment and inspire them to engage in marine conservation. Recent research published in Conservation Biology found in surveys of zoo and aquarium visitors a significant directional relationship between this sense of connection to the animals and self-reported pro-environmental behaviors. Research is another key element of our mission. Our written testimony includes a letter signed by 82 of the leading marine scientists attesting to the essential role of public display in advancing science and ocean conservation. Personally, I had the opportunity to develop diagnostic ultrasound techniques in the 80s working with trained dolphins. These same techniques are used now in wild dolphin population health assessments. This type of research Advancing new diagnostic techniques is needed now more than ever and cannot take place in the wild. Alliance facilities are also global leaders in marine mammal rescue and rehabilitation. We serve as first responders to more than 2,000 stranding incidents each year, investing more than $3 million annually on rescue and rehabilitation. The accumulated knowledge, collective experience, and resources of Alliance members are the primary factors in many successful rehabilitation efforts. At my site in Dolphin Quest, Hawaii, we host workshops for Stranding Network. There, our marine mammal specialists give network volunteers crucial experience of actually handling live dolphins, something they will face in the wild. We teach them how to accurately monitor vital signs and safely handle large animals in the water. When we participate in a rescue, our goal is to restore the animal in good health and return it to the wild. However, that is not always possible. In coordination with NOAA, Alliance members provide long-term homes to many non-releasable animals. When a recent stranded beluga neonate, Tyanek, I'm sure you're familiar with, was rescued at the Alaska Sea Life Center, Alliance members provided on-site expertise and support. Once the calf was stabilized and had gained enough weight, it was successfully transferred to an Alliance member, SeaWorld San Antonio, for long-term care. Administrator Oliver stated at the time that scientific knowledge gained from learning from Tyanek for years to come will benefit Cook Island beluga research and recovery. We agree. Overall, the Act is working effectively, but improvements could be made to streamline the execution of the statute, allowing the agency and Alliance members to focus more time and resources on the important intent of the Act to conserve wild marine mammal populations and the ocean habitats they depend upon. To that end, we have had several productive meetings with NIMS and offer the following suggestions. First, the marine mammal inventory. Unfortunately, it contains significant errors dating back decades, and efforts to correct those errors over the years have been unsuccessful. Furthermore, the inventory includes information that is unverifiable and falls outside of the statutorily mandated points specified in the Act for inclusion. Misinformation contained in the inventory is often quoted and used against our community by organizations that unambiguously say their goal is to end the use of animals in agriculture, sport, and zoological facilities. We were recently threatened by this in the Hawaii legislature. A committee considered legislation that sought to ban the transportation of cetaceans under human care in Hawaii. Not only did animal activists say they used research from the NIMS inventory to initiate this legislation, the bill sponsors included inaccuracies that activists had lifted from the NIMS inventory in the actual bill text. The information about Dolphin Quest, my organization, from the inventory was grossly inaccurate and attributed dolphin deaths to Dolphin Quest, when those animals had never been under our care and actually died decades before Dolphin Quest was even founded. Excuse me. Hang on. Getting over some bronchitis. The Alliance also has concern regarding inconsistencies among regions when NIMS representatives assess stranded live cetaceans. Excuse me. I'm going to need an extra minute. As potential candidates for rescue, or whether they are deemed releasable, some regional NIMS directors recommend that stranded dolphin neonates be routinely euthanized on the beach. Other regions euthanize certain species of whales, citing lack of experience with that species. For many neonates, like the beluga calf Tyanek, we have a fighting chance of saving the animal and providing it with a loving home and a meaningful life. Importantly, working with different species furthers our knowledge of the species and contributes to future success. We urge the Senate to encourage NIMS to resolve these inconsistencies and give Alliance members the opportunity to save stranded cetaceans whenever we can. Excuse me. Finally, I must mention the Prescott grant program. This program provides the only direct funding for the Marine Mammal Stranding Network. Unfortunately, in its fiscal year 2019 budget request, NOAA proposed eliminating the program and its entire budget of $3 million. In addition to eliminating the only federal funding available for stranding programs, this will decrease the data produced, which NOAA uses to establish critical links between the health of marine mammals and the condition of our coastal ecosystems. The Alliance encourages Congress and the agency to restore full funding to this essential program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for allowing me to testify and get through, sorry for my throat, talk about the Alliance. Thank you. Marine mammals in the wild today are threatened at unprecedented levels. The conservation work done by marine parks, aquariums, and zoos is needed now more than ever. We thank you for this opportunity, and we look forward to working with you to ensure that the Act is interpreted and applied in a way that will support critical long-term research and public education taking place at our zoos and aquariums. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Stone. Ms. Davenport, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify in support of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. My name is Jane Davenport, and I'm a senior attorney at Defenders of Wildlife. For 71 years, as of today, Defenders has worked to protect and restore imperiled species and their habitats. We represent more than 1.8 million members and supporters. Americans love marine mammals and want to protect them. For 45 years, the Act has played a central role in protecting and recovering some of our beloved and iconic marine mammal species: whales, sea otters, manatees, seals and sea lions, porpoises, and dolphins. Today, when we can stream nature documentaries on demand, public support for marine mammal conservation is stronger than ever. A poll last year showed that nearly 3/4 of Americans want to protect marine mammals and support the Act. The conservation successes of the Act have had enormous economic benefits. People spend over $1 billion every year in the United States on whale watching and related travel, pumping money into coastal communities that rely on ecotourism. In my years of marine mammal advocacy, I have been repeatedly impressed by how forward-thinking the 92nd Congress was. For example, this act was our first national law mandating an ecosystem approach to wildlife conservation. Subsequent amendments have built on the 1972 Act's strength and flexibility while maintaining the statute's conservation commitment. Defenders and our allies believe there is no need to amend the statute. The Act and its implementing regulations already have mechanisms to protect marine mammals while resolving potential conflicts with commercial fisheries, military readiness, subsistence uses, and pinniped salmon interactions. The 1994 amendments established science-based metrics and innovative planning procedures to ensure that commercial fisheries do not kill unsustainable numbers of marine mammals. One such innovation was the requirement to develop take reduction plans with the input of take reduction teams. These teams are stakeholder groups of fishermen, state and federal fisheries agency staff, scientists, and conservationists that develop consensus-based recommendations to inform agency regulations. In one example, the harbor porpoise team recommended the use of acoustic pingers to deter these tiny porpoises from gillnets. As a result, harbor porpoise deaths in the Northeast gillnet fishery dropped dramatically, from over 3,000 to fewer than 400 each year. The porpoise population has recovered substantially, while the gillnet fleet continues to operate successfully. The 1994 amendments also added the mechanism for addressing interactions between seals and sea lions and declining or imperiled salmon stocks in the Northwest. The states of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington currently have a permit authorizing lethal removal of up to 92 California sea lions a year in the Columbia River. These states have never come close to killing their allotted quota. When states have not exercised the full authorization they already have, the Act should not be amended to allow more sea lion removals, particularly since their removal cannot solve the myriad and far greater man-made threats to salmon recovery. With respect to military readiness, the Act was substantially amended in 2003, responding to DoD concerns about obtaining permits for killing, injuring, and harassing marine mammals via sonar and explosives. Among other modifications to the Act's requirements, these amendments permit the Secretary of Defense to invoke at any time a 2-year renewable exemption from the Act for any action or category of actions if necessary for national defense. Although the Act has been a conservation success, this is no time to rest on our laurels. We must not weaken the statute, either passively through underfunding or actively by amendment. Marine mammals face significant new threats from climate change and ocean industrialization. Noise pollution levels impair marine mammals' ability to hear and be heard, find food and mates, and nurture their young, and thus their very ability to survive. We are extremely concerned about proposed seismic airgun blasting surveys for offshore oil and gas deposits. This blasting, imminent in the Atlantic, threatens to harass, injure, or even kill thousands of marine mammals. Longer term, fossil fuel exploration and development pose both catastrophic and chronic cumulative risks to marine mammals. One of the species most at risk from seismic blasting is the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. This species will likely be functionally extinct in 20 years if we do not act immediately to ensure its habitat is safe. In the last year alone, 18 dead right whales have been found. This calving season, not a single calf was seen. With all the threats facing right whales and other marine mammals, we strongly oppose any proposal that would weaken the Act's protections. In a changing world, we must maintain the Act's conservation commitment, not abandon it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Davenport, and I'm going to start questioning. And thank you all the witnesses for your very informative testimony. Let me begin, and this is for Mr. Oliver and Mr. Miller, but with regard to the issue of subsistence under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and particularly as it relates to Alaska Natives. Can you explain a little bit of how important that is? Both, Mr. Miller, you touched on that in terms of entire communities. I think sometimes these hearings are helping to educate us, but also this is all for the record, so other staff members and senators who aren't here will be able to be informed by your testimony. But I think sometimes, particularly in Alaska, down here in Washington, there's not a good understanding of what subsistence means, how it's important culturally, how it's important literally for food. We don't have a lot of big grocery stores in some of our smaller communities. Can the two of you talk a little bit about subsistence, and do you think it's working well, the MMPA, as it relates to subsistence opportunities, and what changes you would recommend one way or the other on that very important topic, which is a key element of the MMPA?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll give it a shot at it. Subsistence is an interesting term. It's a word there's often a lot of debate from our communities that are afraid it doesn't fully encompass what it means, because it's oftentimes we use cultural and traditional, and sometimes people refer to subsistence as just a food item. I can't emphasize enough how the food, though, is connected to the communities in a lot of our rural communities in Alaska, and access to the food in ways that it has been traditionally harvested and used through all parts of life is essential to that. It's tied to a way of life. When access to a way of life is compromised, you start to see the anomalies then, because you have a way of life in a community breaking down, and that's where you see the other behaviors that start to show up, the substance abuse issues, the domestic violence, the loss of a direction for a community. And the government spends a lot of money trying to fix those side effects from a loss of the breakdown of way of life. So I can't emphasize enough how important the access to traditional foods, all the parts of the community that are tied to it. The Act itself actually is stronger than a lot of other legislation that deal with subsistence issues, whether it's fish or game in the state of Alaska. So it, again, as I referenced in testimony, it has wonderful language to work with. It hasn't been fully utilized, we don't think, but again, the harvest management plans and the structures that I referenced briefly. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I was in a car wreck on the way over here in the taxi, and my papers got a little mixed up. So
we heard you had quite the adventure getting from Alaska to D.C., car wrecks and all kinds of things. We're glad you're here safely.
Yep, snowed out for the first hearing and was in a lockdown this morning for a couple hours with the shooter incident and a car wreck on the way, so I was telling people I don't know if they should sit next to me or not. So, but Anyway, I'm glad I'm here because it is essential to our communities. We have communities that rely on walrus, for example, for I believe it's 70 to 80% of their diet, of the meat diet, and they don't have another access to it. And then also they use the ivory as a primary means of economic support for the community, and there is not an alternative. So again, we'd like to work with provisions that maybe could make things stronger, but the Act does better than most in addressing subsistence issues. And just finally on the issue, our communities take this very seriously. The harvest of marine mammals and use of it is very cultural. For a lot of people, it's very spiritual. It's not anything to take lightly. It's not just taking animals for sport or just to go do it. It is part of their way of life, a way of life that would not exist without it. So thanks for the question, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Oliver, you have anything to add to that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just from an agency perspective, we have numerous co-management partnerships with various Alaska Native organizations that are absolutely essential to our effective management of various marine mammal stocks. We simply could not monitor subsistence harvest to ensure sustainability without the information and participation of the hunters. I would note that I know there's been suggestion about amending the MMPA in a way that ensures opportunities for any tribal members to hunt marine mammals versus the 25% blood quantum standard that is currently in NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service regulations. I know we've been discussing this issue closely with the Indigenous Peoples Council and the Alaska Federation of Natives. I think there's some difference of opinion on that even within the Native community. My point is that we're open to the possibility of changing our regulations or the statute to address those issues and concerns to ensure that all Alaska tribal members can enjoy that opportunity. And I guess the final thing I would say is one of the most important intersections that we have is through the International Whaling Commission and the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission. We have up for renegotiation later this year the subsistence bowhead well quotas, which are, as you know and I know, are so critically important as not only a food source but a tradition and a custom for Native communities in northern Alaska. We're going to be advocating strongly to reenact the 67, I believe it is, bowhead well quota for the next 5 years, and also negotiating to change the rollover provision that it will allow those unused strikes, 50%, to be rolled over, because we really, with the change in environmental conditions up there, and it varies, the harvestability and success is varying from year to year, we really need that flexibility, I think, to maintain that bowhead well hunt in the traditional way. So there are various ways that this is critically important, and I know from living there for 27 years how important it is.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate your focus on those issues. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you. So the original goal of the MMPA was to conserve and protect marine mammals after finding that certain species and stocks of mammals were in danger of extinction or depletion because of human activity. The Act, as we've reviewed, was updated in 1994 with a requirement for the development of take reduction plans to limit the unsustainable killing of marine mammals by commercial fisheries using science-based metrics and multi-stakeholder input. Ms. Davenport, you've already, in your testimony, expressed views about the success of the Marine Mammal Protection Act in achieving its original intent. Certainly feel free to add to that, but how would the take reduction teams, how do they balance the needs of commercial interests while limiting the take of certain species? And why don't you answer that, and I have a follow-up too.
Yes, thank you, Senator Baldwin. So I'm actually a member of 4 take reduction teams myself. So I can speak from personal experience. Every take reduction team has its own personality and set of players. But what I think is so innovative about the take reduction team process is it's not simply a question of the agency coming up with a regulation to meet the statutory goals of ensuring that human-caused take of marine mammals in these particular fisheries that require take reduction plans has to come down to a level that is either at or no more than what's called the potential biological removal level, with the goal of approaching a zero mortality rate goal. So the plan's goals are set by statute, but the take reduction team process enables the various stakeholders to come together, and there's usually presentations by National Marine Fisheries Service scientists and often state agency scientists on what do we know about what's going on with the species. So it's a very data-driven process. Because the statute requires the agency to do stock assessment reports, we have that information to draw on to understand what does the best available data tell us about what's going on with this species and the impacts that the fishery might be having on it. But then what I think is a really productive aspect of the team process when it's functioning successfully is that it's a moderated discussion, but it's a very free-flowing discussion around the ideas and around the table with ideas of what additional restrictions do we need to enable the plan to reach that goal of taking no more than PBR, and that's a process that involves listening to the scientists. It involves listening to the fishermen, and when they say, I'm setting my gill net in this particular area, and I really need that. That's a huge part of my catch, and that's therefore a huge part of my income. That kind of very personal information and that on-the-water information enables the team often to come up with essentially compromise. What about if we have a restriction on, setting at dawn and dusk when the marine mammals are more likely to be coming in and feeding, and it's very negotiations-based and discussion-based process that then it doesn't determine what the regulations will be, but it feeds into the set of consensus recommendations that then the agency can take and determine, how to structure a rulemaking around that. So, in my view, it really functions best when people come to the table and they're representing their own constituency, whether that's the scientific community or, in my role, the environmental organization, or, the fishermen have their colleagues on speed dial and say, hey, we're talking about this. How would this work for you in your particular area? And I think that it's a real give and take process. And I think, in my experience in environmental law, it's a very unique kind of process that really allows the agency to hear from all the stakeholders, and it enables the stakeholders to talk to each other, not just in terms of, we're now all submitting comments on this proposed rule and having a clash, but really enabling that kind of understanding that can lead to compromise. And I think in many cases it's worked very successfully. The example I gave was the harbor porpoise one, and that was I'm not on, I wasn't on the team at the time the pingers were being developed, but that was very much a process that depended on, fishermen knowledge of the fishery, how the porpoises interact with their nets, and, getting the experimental gear to them so they could test it and see what happened. So, I think it's definitely a model for conservation that can happen that minimizes, to some extent, the conflicts between various interests.
Thank you.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Mr. Chairman, since the enactment of the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972,
Were you here then?
I can't believe a law got passed in this country before I got here.
Okay,
but this
I'm
happens to
just
be one of
checking.
the
You've had a very distinguished career.
It's
I
my
know.
42nd year in Congress, so
Okay.
most of the laws that are the Constitution all got passed environmentally just in the 4 or 5 years before I got here. The Clean Air Act of 90, the Marine Mammal Act of 72, the 1970 Clean Air Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, et cetera. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was created in 1974. Anyway, that's an aside. Thank you. If I can have an extra minute, thank you. But I just wanted to respond.
Normally, we don't give an extra
I'm very
minute
proud.
to a soliloquy by the member, but in this case, I'll let you have it.
I appreciate it. Thank you. So, since the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972, no marine mammals have gone extinct. And under the MMPA, we have taken numerous steps here in the United States to protect marine mammals, including the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. And I'm proud of the science-driven solutions in my home state of Massachusetts that have helped the right whale. 10 years ago, a simple shift in the shipping lane of commercial vessels in and out of Boston Harbor dramatically reduced ship strike mortalities of whales while only increasing travel time for those vessels by 10 to 20 minutes. And fishermen in New England have taken steps to lessen the odds of whale entanglements in fishing gear. However, the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale migrates between the United States and Canadian waters. While fishermen in Massachusetts and elsewhere in the United States have taken important steps to protect these whales, I am concerned that Canada is not sufficiently following suit. 70% of all right whale deaths last year occurred in Canadian waters, and at least 6 right whales were entangled in Canadian snow crab fishing gear. It is imperative that Canada increases its gear standards to match American standards. We have the Marine Mammal Protection Act to address exactly this sort of crisis because it requires that other nations ensure that their commercial fishing practices meet U.S. standards. The Marine Mammal Protection Act requires nations that export fishing products to the United States to have the same standards to protect marine mammals as we do. Foreign nations have been granted a 5-year exemption until January 10th, 2022 to develop comparable marine mammal protection standards. But in the case of the North Atlantic right whale, we may not have 5 years to act and save this species. And that is why I and 10 other senators have sent a letter today asking NOAA to evaluate whether marine mammal conservation standards in Canada's Atlantic fisheries are sufficient. So, Mr. Oliver, we know Canadian fisheries contribute to North Atlantic right whale deaths. Will you commit to have NOAA Fisheries expedite this comparability review process under the MMPA for Canadian fisheries, given the right whale crisis that exists today?
Senator, until today, we had not been petitioned or initiated a comparability finding, but it seems as though we're likely to undertake such an endeavor soon. We have been working very closely with Canada and the government.
By soon, you mean?
Yes.
What do you mean by soon? By soon, you say you will do it soon.
Assuming we receive such a request today, I assume we would initiate movement on that tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, sir.
But we have been working very closely with the government of Canada, and they've recently announced a number of measures, including ship speed restrictions, gear restrictions, moving closure areas that they would implement depending on right whale sightings. We certainly are looking to Canada to step up, if you will, in the way that we have implemented measures in the U.S. We are reinitiating our fisheries biological opinion on our fisheries, but we don't want to unnecessarily impose additional restrictions on our fishermen until we see comparable movement on the Canadian side. I would note it does look like they're making movement. We have been working very closely with them, and so I expect positive movement from Canada on this issue.
But if Canada's regulations are not found to be as protective as ours, the MMPA actually requires that the U.S. ban Canadian seafood imports. Will NOAA take that step as required by law should Canadian regulations be found to be less protective?
Presuming we came to a non-comparability finding, we would be compelled, I believe, to restrict at least those fisheries for which a non-comparability finding is made.
Okay, and you're going to begin soon to begin that process, because the timeline does matter. These whales have a ticking clock that is now signaling a day where extinction gets closer and closer. So we thank you for that, because now is the right time for the right whale to be given the protections which they deserve. And I appreciate the attention that NOAA will be giving to it. Thank you. And if I can just ask one final question, and that is, would seismic testing and offshore drilling put our marine mammals, including the right whale and fisheries, at greater risk?
If I understood your question.
Does a Trump administration plan to begin seismic testing and offshore drilling off of every state in the United States, with the exception of Florida, for some reason that has to do with a Senate race that is going on down there? But in terms of the other states, will there be? Is there evidence historically that seismic testing and drilling does, in fact, including the right whale, put them at greater danger?
Sir, cetaceans in general are sensitive to acoustic activity. We have had that going on for many decades in the Gulf of Mexico, and we're currently reevaluating seismic activity under an incidental take authorization in the Gulf. We last June issued proposed rules for incidental harassment authorizations for 5 Atlantic coast seismic activity applications, and we're in the process of evaluating over 117,000 comments that we received on that, many of them of a highly technical, legal, policy nature. So that process has taken a little bit longer than we expect, but we expect within the next few weeks to have made a decision on those authorizations. I would note that the unprecedented 17 right whale deaths that occurred in 2017 occurred in the absence of any seismic activity on the Atlantic coast.
Exactly, and I appreciate that, sir. My belief is that the Trump drilling plan is a triple whammy for the right whales. One, it would harm the whales with seismic testing. 2, it would increase the risk of an oil spill. And 3, all to burn more fossil fuels that contribute to climate change, which is greatly impacting ocean habitats, including that for the right whale. So in each aspect of this issue, it comes back to harming not just right whales, okay, but all other species that could potentially be endangered. So I thank you for your attention to those issues, Mr. Oliver, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Absolutely. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I have 2 questions at least. One concerns marine designated areas. As everybody on the panel knows, the Trump administration has threatened to eliminate about half of all highly protected areas in America's oceans, the largest ever rollback of ocean protections in the history of the United States, including allowing commercial extraction in the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument, other similar areas on the West Coast. I'm proud of the work that I did and others joined me to persuade the Obama administration to create the first ever marine monument in the Atlantic Ocean. It's a spectacular underwater seascape that is precious, priceless, beautiful, and extraordinarily important to Connecticut and to our nation. It's important not only environmentally and aesthetically, it's also a biodiverse and pristine marine ecosystem that generates a lot of sea life. It enables benefits to marine mammals as well. I assume everyone on the panel would agree with that proposition, and I hope everyone on the panel would agree that eliminating marine designated areas like the Northeast Canyons and Seamount Marine National Monument would affect marine mammals adversely. They depend on these areas to forage, for abundant prey, to breed, to raise their young, to engage in other important life-sustaining activities. Does anyone on the panel disagree with what I've just said, and if so, why? The record should note that the panel is silent, indicating its agreement. Thank you. Let me move on to the second question to Mr. Oliver. I'm pretty alarmed that the budget for, the proposed budget for FY 2019 slashes funding to NOAA by about 20% or $1 billion. That means zeroing out programs all around the country, like the Sea Grant and funding for the Milford Lab in Milford, Connecticut, and for the University of Connecticut. I'm sure there are many other similar programs in states that my colleagues represent. As you know, NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service, the office you oversee, and that's charged with protecting marine mammals under MMMP, is facing a $110.4 million or 14% budget cut. President Trump also wants to cut $4.8 million from habitat and conservation programs, wiping out funding and grants for NOAA's fisheries, habitat restoration projects. As someone who has spent literally decades as a biologist, a scientist, and administrator in the Pacific fisheries management program, and now heading an agency with direct responsibility here, are you concerned about these budget cuts?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I will acknowledge that these budget cuts pose some significant challenges for us. They also are largely focused on many of our external grant programs, so I recognize they also pose challenges and hardships for many of the people, including researchers that support our mission, that previously relied on those grants, and that includes the Prescott grant program for marine mammals as well. And so I do recognize that the choices that the administration has made with respect to trade-offs in our budget will, not only for our agency, for many agencies, pose challenges for us, and we hope to be able to meet those to the best of our ability.
Well, I'm going to first compliment you on your diplomatic answer, which I fully expected. The idea that you pose challenges, I think, is a profound euphemism for what's really at stake here, and I'm not being critical of you personally, because these decisions are not made by you, and you don't have to respond, but I do think that we are ignoring a deep and enduring failure impending in these budget cuts, that for all the talk on this panel and in this room and in the Congress and around the country will have real and lasting consequences for our nation and for marine mammals and other environmental values that we share. So thank you for being here today, and thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. I'm going to return to some of the questioning I have here and for all our witnesses. And, you know, I want to go back to a topic that we talked about, that Mr. Oliver, you talked about a little bit in your comments. You know, Senator Markey talks about the North Atlantic right whale, which my understanding is that's under stress. And is that listed right now?
Yes, sir. It's one of the more highly endangered species on the planet. I think there's 450 or 60 of them left.
And so we should be focused on trying to certainly help that with recovery on the, in the North Pacific, as you know, for example, the bowhead whale recovery has been very dramatic, has it not?
Yes, sir.
And can you talk a little bit about the traditional knowledge that helped that? That's both for you and Mr. Miller. I think it's very interesting that, if you look at the history of that, you had the Western scientists go out there kind of saying, hey, the bowhead's at one level in terms of numbers, but the Alaska natives who had been fishing and harvesting that whale for thousands of years had a much, much better sense of what the real numbers were. So can you talk about how traditional knowledge helps, particularly in actual more accurate assessments? Because I don't think a lot of people, I think everybody thinks, oh, if it's a Western scientist over someone else, they're always right. In this case, wasn't it true, Mr. Miller, that the Alaska Native whaling captains had a much better sense of the true numbers of the stocks, and finally the Western scientists agreed with them?
I'll try my best to answer that. Being from Southeast, I'm a bit removed from the whaling captains.
Or Mr. Oliver.
But they did, I've worked a lot with the folks that work with that commission, if I might. And they did. The numbers came out early on as very, very small population that was estimated, and the whalers said, no, there is a lot more whales than you're seeing. And I think we found that, especially in a lot of the Arctic species, that we had a science community that oftentimes was coming in seasonally, and so they get a snapshot, but that's not the full picture of the whales. I think there was other science-related issues. The whalers always knew that whales could smell, and that was something that later was proven, but the people already knew that. The ice conditions were, as it ties to whaling, were something that people inherently knew. And so you can kind of go down the list of, not just for whales, but also for other Arctic species, that there's these knowledge structures, the base knowledge that's there. And it really has hurt in times when the Western scientists said, no, that's not relevant, it's just people's observations. But the observational community science, and from the people that actually spend their lives in the ecosystem, how the species interact with each other and different conditions affect things, have been quite useful to the science community that accepts it.
Let me ask a related question for both of you. This morning in the Commerce Committee, the committee passed with a strong bipartisan support a bill of mine and co-sponsored by Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island that would set up a domestic process through which the Secretary of Commerce can preserve the bowhead whale subsistence harvest for Alaska Native food security if the quota, if the International Whaling Commission fails to act as they're working towards a reauthorization of the quota in September 2018. This is something that's been very strongly bipartisan. The Obama administration previously was a strong supporter of the whale harvest quota at the IWC. Can the two of you just talk about how important that issue is to the communities on the North Slope, and the institutional knowledge that we would lose if for some reason the harvest quota were not accepted at the IWC? We don't think that's going to happen, but we're very focused on it. And Mr. Oliver, I know you are, and we appreciate that. Can you give us a sense of that?
Yes, Mr.
And you
Chairman.
talked about it briefly, but it's a really important issue for my constituents.
I'll give you a two-part answer, and part of it's in response to your previous question and the importance of the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission in the IWC process. And I know our commissioner, Ryan Wolf, spent a week in Barrow recently meeting with folks, the hunters. I know many of them personally.
Yeah, we appreciate that.
And I think that information, it feeds importantly into the IWC discussions, including endorsements of that information by the IWC's own science panel. I do think that we, of course, are going to negotiate strongly with our Russian Aboriginal whaling partners who predominantly focus on gray whales, and we on bowhead, but nevertheless negotiate strenuously to re-up for the following 5 years that bowhead whale quota. We've also made the assertion, at least at the NOAA level, that even without that concurrence by the IWC, we read the terms of the convention that we could potentially implement our own quotas, but having the backup of that type of legislative underpinning would certainly give us a sense of security going into those negotiations.
Well, that was the reason for it, and we're hopeful that you can utilize that and the State Department the way the Obama administration had worked on that quota previously. So we appreciate your support on that, and it's a very important issue. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you. Climate change poses growing threats to my home state of Wisconsin, and we know the Great Lakes region also, and frankly, the world. The oceans are warming, becoming more acidic, and losing oxygen. Mr. Oliver and Ms. Davenport, what do we know and what don't we know about how climate change and ocean acidification can, how they affect marine mammals? And then I have a follow-up, but why don't we start with you, Mr. Oliver?
Well, I'll give that a shot. I mean, our goal is to figure out what the implications are of the changing climate change, warming, as it regards fish, as well as how it, with regard to its implications for marine mammals. I would say that what we don't know far outweighs what we do know. And so that's one of the big challenges we have, is figuring that out. We have to, we're not going to tell the fish or the marine mammals where or how to move in response to global climate change. They're going to tell us. And so we're still trying to figure that out. And so I don't have a brilliant answer. I don't have a definitive answer. It's going to vary by different marine mammal species and stocks and geographic area. So I would simply acknowledge that that is a very critical part of the puzzle that we have before us, and we don't underestimate it.
Okay. Ms. Davenport, and then I have a follow-up.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. As a member of the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team, which is the one that addresses the North Atlantic right whale, we recently had the benefit of a webinar that NOAA Fisheries put on for us about copepods, which are the tiny little zooplankton that right whales eat, and they're very picky eaters. It's basically what they eat at a particular life stage. And what this webinar was updating us on is essentially the latest information on how changing oceanographic conditions are changing the concentrations of where these copepods are, which then, of course, affects where right whales go to feed on them. And it used to be that you could practically set your watch by the right whales about where they're going to be when. And unfortunately, so much of our knowledge of that has to get thrown out the window because they have to move where the food is. But one of the takeaways for me out of that webinar actually echoes what Senator Blumenthal was just talking about, and that was that on the Canadian side of the border, they have these research stations where they study on an annual basis, an ongoing basis. They do these zooplankton surveys, so they have a really good idea of how the resource is reacting in any given year. And the researchers who were giving this webinar for us was saying that the funding is spotty to non-existent. So part of the issue for them is not having that basic scientific information on an annual basis for comparison that would inform us about what is the status of this zooplankton resource, which of course is important not only for the right whale but also as the basis for the aquatic food chain. So I was really struck by how different the data can be depending on whether the researchers have the resources they need to go out and get it on an annual basis and then, of course, analyze it. So I certainly agree that we don't know nearly enough, but I think it calls for much greater funding for this basic research to try to understand how the resources are changing. And then, of course, we have to have that as much information as we can in order to base management decisions on for the right whale or any other species of marine wildlife that may be affected by its shifting prey resources.
Okay. My follow-up for you, Mr. Oliver, is with climate change posing new uncertainties for marine mammals, how will the National Marine Fisheries Service prioritize its use of funds for studying and protecting marine mammals under the MMPA?
Well, I think probably in a similar way that we'll look at prioritizing research for basic fishery stock assessments. We have to go around region by region and evaluate what our budgetary parameters are for each of our science centers, our laboratories, our research facilities. Some of this work is coordinated with other NOAA line offices, including OAR, NOS, and others. So I don't have a prioritization plan that I could present to you today.
Great. Thank you. I have a few more questions for our witnesses. And Mr. Norman, I'm not going to let you come all this way and not have an opportunity to say a few words. So let me ask you, the Chinook that you're talking about, are those are endangered?
Yeah, there's 32 populations, but
the one that you were talking about in your
segment that
testimony.
is listed as endangered and another segment that's listed as threatened.
Okay, so that's an important issue. And I think it highlights really one of the issues that I touched on in my opening statement, which is you have mandates of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and you have mandates of the Endangered Species Act. And in the case that you're talking about, do you think those are conflicting mandates? Are they? What's the solution from your perspective? Because obviously, the king salmon is a very, very important species, and if we think that predation of the sea lions is a major cause, what's your perspective? And are the laws conflicting? Does it make it harder for Mr. Oliver and others to help manage this stock of one of the most incredible fish on the planet?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there is certainly conflicts between, I guess, the natural resource management conundrum of trying to protect and recover these endangered salmon, and then certainly trying to protect the marine mammals through the Marine Mammal Protection Act. I think Section 120, which was enacted in the 1990s, was certainly focused on trying to at least address specific issues like we're now seeing in the Columbia River. Section 120 was originally enacted associated with a similar problem in the Ballard Locks in Lake Washington in the state of Washington. Different situation, about a dozen sea lions in a small area. And so Section 120 was developed specific for that kind of situation. In the Columbia River, a very large system, hundreds of sea lions, and with this, as I indicated earlier, this new unusual behavior of moving over 100 miles upstream to predate on salmon. One of the most difficult issues associated with the current Section 120 provisions is the requirement to identify an individual sea lion that's causing significant impact on an endangered species. That requires the agencies, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the state agencies to actually observe one particular sea lion and be able to identify that individual before they're on the list and eligible for removal. So that in itself is a very time-consuming and expensive endeavor, and it only enables a fraction of those animals that are moving that far upstream to be removed. So I think one of the, Mr. Chairman, you'd asked for, well, what's the solution?
Yeah.
And one of the amendment proposals is to identify or change that particular definition for an individual causing significant harm to be associated with the geography in the river. So if they're above 112 miles in the river, the studies indicate that they are focusing almost entirely on salmon and steelhead, or in the tributaries that also have salmon and steelhead, endangered salmon and steelhead returning. So kind of redefining the definition of animal that's causing significant impact. So it takes away that laborious process in order to be able to remove.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And Mr. Oliver, this would be a topic of an entire other hearing that we probably need to entertain, and that's the weakness of the king run in different parts of not only the Pacific Northwest but in Alaska. I was just back home in Southeast, Mr. Miller, and for example, in Ketchikan, they've canceled the Derby, and I think that's the first time ever. So we need to get a handle on that, because the runs, particularly the king runs in Alaska, in certain areas of part of the state are really weak, and I think there's a lot of possibilities for the reason for that, but having your expertise weigh in would be really important. Dr. Stone, I just wanted to thank you for your discussion of Tyonek, and can you help us describe a little bit more that you already touched on it, but the benefits and importance of that kind of example in the professional care of mammals, marine mammals, and expert aquariums that you represent.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, and thank you for the correction on the pronunciation. I have not had the opportunity to meet him personally. But anytime we have an opportunity to work with a stranded animal, we have an enormous opportunity to gather information about the individual animal, about the species, about the causes of the stranding, and also to reflect on the implied and sometimes very specific causes of our changes in our ecosystem that might be behind the reason for the stranding, whether it's decreased prey, malnutrition, infectious diseases, certainly plastics. Debris is a huge issue for us and for our animals in the wild. We see animals coming ashore with a huge amount of non-digestible plastics in their intestinal tracts. We see animals that are emaciated because they've been carrying enormous amounts of gear, fishing gear, either abandoned fishing gear, and have been essentially starving over probably weeks or months. So we learn not only about the animal and the species, but also about our coastal ecosystems from addressing stranded animals. And I think this is a really important part of the Prescott grant, that losing the Prescott grant will not only affect funding for stranding, but also the collection of that data, which dolphins and whales are often referred to as the canaries of the ocean. And if we lose that information, then we're going to lose vital information that we could gather about fish stocks and other issues affecting ocean climate change and other related problems. We also have the opportunity in working with novel species to learn about the physiology of that species, its hearing capacity perhaps, and other parameters that could help us better protect them in the wild. The care that's given to those individual animals is extraordinary, and I can speak to that from personal experience. In working with stranded animals, we often are with them 24/7. It often involves veterinary care, trained marine mammal specialists who are expert at handling these animals, taking lab samples, ultrasound, digital radiography, diagnostics, therapeutics, fluids, intensive care, essentially. And sometimes that intensive care can go on literally for months. Sometimes it doesn't end well. Sometimes we lose the animal, but we still learn from each of those instances. And oftentimes we can save them, and particularly now with neonates. We are doing such an extraordinary job of raising baby dolphins now that we want the opportunity to save those animals and not have them euthanized on the beach, so that we can provide them with loving homes and they can have a meaningful life as an ambassador for their species.
Well, I appreciate that. I also appreciate your mention of plastics. It's a topic and that I've been very focused on. You may have seen Senator Whitehouse and I had a bill, the Save Our Seas Act,
Yes.
that has already passed the Senate and calls for not only increased NOAA focus on the ocean debris plastics problem, but calls for an international agreement. And I think there's a lot of encouragement that we're seeing from the Trump administration to undertake that. So we're gonna keep working on that issue in a bipartisan way, but it's a hugely important issue for all of us.
Well, it's also a very important issue for our constituency. We have over 40 million visitors a year, and plastic debris and recycling and refusing plastics, as you'll see, I have my water bottle here, is very important. And I think that we all can do a better job of encouraging our supply chains, our visitors, our employees to walk that talk. And so I would pledge the Alliance of Marine Mammal Parks and Aquariums to help you with that initiative.
Good, good. We're excited about it. You have any other?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would like to pursue the earlier line of questioning between the chair and Mr. Norman about the predation of threatened and endangered steelhead and salmon by sea lions in the Pacific Northwest. And here, two additional perspectives on the mechanisms by which the MMPA could address the issue. I'm wondering, Ms. Davenport, if you can speak to that, followed by Mr. Oliver.
Thank you, Senator. If I understand your question, you're asking how the existing mechanisms of the MMPA can be used to address this issue?
Yes, I am.
Well, I think that the most important part is there are existing mechanisms in the statute, and I understand why there's the concern about identifying individual animals, but the fact of the matter is these salmon runs face far greater threats than any individual or even, as a group, these pinnipeds. One fact that I learned from a colleague at another organization who works exclusively on trying to save the southern resident killer whale, which is entirely dependent on Chinook salmon, is that the one issue that she's identified is that the hatcheries will release all of their baby fish at one time. So that's basically ringing the dinner bell for these pinnipeds, and they're not stupid. They're top predators for a reason. They are able to learn that at a certain time, dinner, breakfast, and lunch are served. So I think that there needs to be a lot more careful thought put into how are we trying to save the salmon? Are we targeting the sea lions because we see them eating the fish, but are we actually doing other things around our management of activities that could help ameliorate that problem? And also, if I may, speaking to Senator Sullivan's question, you asked a question about whether the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act themselves are in conflict here. And I would say no. The problem is not a tension between the statutes. The problem, as multiple courts have found over many years, is that the National Marine Fisheries Service hasn't done an adequate job under the Endangered Species Act in consulting under that statute and coming up with biological opinions that can appropriately address the impacts of how the dams are managed. So I think there's a lot more work to be done on managing the dams, on managing hatcheries, on looking at human impacts on these salmon runs, which weren't endangered previously before we started building these dams. We need to look at renewable energy sources so we can get away from these dams. There's so many different aspects of this problem that focusing on, we're gonna kill our way out of it by killing sea lions, that may be an aspect of it with respect to these potentially problematic individuals, but it just can't be the whole solution. We are just not going to be able to manage the predators in order to save the salmon when they face so many different threats.
Mr. Oliver.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I might have a little bit different perspective on it. One of the things that's consumed a tremendous amount of my time since I've taken this position is I think there are 27 different endangered or threatened runs of salmonids on the West Coast, and whether it's hydropower, agriculture, timber, water storage and diversion, tremendous amount of time our agency spends on ESA consultations on all those projects and MMPA permitting. And we impose hundreds of millions of, probably billions of dollars of mitigation activities and measures over the years on these various infrastructure projects. And at the same time as Mr. Norman, to protect these endangered and threatened runs. And in the case of this particular issue, there's Chinook salmon and steelhead. It's also endangered giant sturgeon that are being eaten, literally the bellies ripped out and the eggs eaten out of them at these locations, particularly at the Bonneville Dam, and now more are showing up on the Willamette. And in some cases in recent years, significant segments of the population, despite the billions of dollars of mitigation measures we're requiring on other industries, these sea lions have become acclimated and trained to eat at the buffet line. And I recently had the opportunity to visit the Bonneville Dam about 3 weeks ago and look at the fish passage systems. Had Oregon and Washington State personnel, biologists, show me the sea lion mitigation facility and how that works. And the problem, as Mr. Norman noted, with identifying individual culprits that are doing a significant damage to the population, I think there's no question that significant damage is being done both individually and collectively, but you have to capture these animals, brand them, release them, monitor them 24/7 for activities. I personally can't imagine that these animals are swimming 140 miles up this river to this very specific location to sunbathe. They're there to eat salmon, steelhead, and sturgeon. And so I personally believe that the notion of having to rely on the individual identifiable factor is constraining our ability to mitigate what I think is a significant problem.
Thank you, and it's a good discussion on that. I'm going to ask one final question, and it goes back to one of the topics I mentioned in it. It's under the MMPA, it's clear legally, and you can just say, yes, I think everybody here knows that, Alaska Natives are allowed to harvest and then actually use for native crafts walrus ivory, correct? Everybody's nodding their head. So we want to work with everybody here, and Ms. Davenport, that would certainly include you. We had the World Wildlife Federation testify at a field hearing I had on this topic, the bill I had, the Ivory Act, which would certainly say, look, we understand the issue with regard to the African elephant and the ban that's on that kind of ivory. But Mr. Miller, can you just very briefly talk about what's going on in Alaska Native communities and Alaska Native artisans? Because I know from talking to a lot of our constituents back home that they're seeing a dramatic drop in people who are purchasing or interested in purchasing their crafts. And now we have states that are literally, and it's well-intentioned, banning the sale in their states of what is a clearly legal product. And, I don't think Alaska could get away with banning Hollywood movies, even though it's not such a great product all the time. And so that shouldn't be the case where another state can say, we're going to ban Alaska Native handicrafts and art from ivory. That's completely legal. Nobody argues that it is. So can you just touch on the harm that that's doing and how important it is to get some, and I think it's well-intentioned. I don't think anyone's doing this to target, Alaska Natives, but it's really harming economies. And as you know, some of the artists are some of the biggest resource producers in terms of the economy and dollars in a small village that we have. Can you talk about that and how important that is for all of us in a bipartisan way to fix this?
I'll give it a try, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that question. It's, you're right, we're starting to see the impacts, and it has been for several years now, just about the misconceptions, I think, of the actual harvest. And and how it ties into the, as I testified earlier, just the makeup of the community. It is essential economic driver in a lot of communities, especially the Ivory, that it is the sole source of income for the community.
Yeah.
So it's very important that there's a clear understanding, and we've tried to look at education for people that come to the tourists that come to the communities and explain there is a difference. But we're very concerned as we're watching, especially state efforts to say, okay, because it's ivory, we're just going to lump all ivory together because you can't distinguish, but you can.
And unfortunately, that's growing. The states are...
It's unfortunately, but oftentimes what we're seeing, it appears that states, instead of stopping on ivory too, are just lumping everything together and saying marine mammals. And so it starts affecting sea otter fur, polar bear fur, or sealskin as well. And so it's a snowball effect.
Yeah.
We'd love to have more time to explain. If people actually saw the meaning in the communities, they might be a lot more receptive to specifically saying, okay, if it's coming from an Alaska Native harvest, that it is well managed. The species that the products are coming from are not endangered. It's from communities that...
And perfectly legal under federal law.
And perfectly legal. So we did see people that were just, for fear of traveling with it, or just say, well, I'm not sure if I can go home with it, or whatever the case. And we actually have had quite a few people that, with legal ivory, have had it seized as they go through customs or with TSA, and so there's no shortage.
Well, we're going to work to fix this in a bipartisan way. I think everybody's well-intentioned here. I think a lot of the environmental groups are also supporting what we're trying to do, so we want to work with everybody here, and I appreciate that. Well, listen, this has been a very informative panel. I want to thank my ranking member again. I am going to end by asking unanimous consent that the following documents be admitted to the record. There is the Alaska State Senate Joint Resolution number 4, urging the United States Congress to pass legislation providing for the exemption of legally acquired walrus, mammoth, Macedon ivory from laws that ban the sale, use, and possession of ivory. The Alaska State Senate Joint Resolution number 13 that looks at the Marine Mammal Protection Act. This was recently passed on a co-management take study of sea otters, which is a big issue back home, and we might have additional questions for the record on the sea otter issue back home. The Alaska Federation of Natives 2017 Annual Convention Resolution 1725, letter from the Alaska Board of Fisheries to Secretary Inky and Secretary Ross regarding the Southeast sea otter population growth impacts, letter from the Alaska State Senator Bert Steadman regarding marine mammal predation and shellfish and salmon in Southeast Alaska dated April 23rd, 2018 with attachments, a statement from the Southeast Alaska Regional Dive Fisheries Association regarding the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and a letter from the Southeast Alaskan Fishermen's Alliance regarding predator management under the MMPA dated April 24th, 2018, without objection. And this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you again very much for our witnesses. This is outstanding testimony.